And now, it's time for the Cannabis Reporter Radio Show with Snowden Bishop. Listen in as Snowden interviews cannabis industry pioneers, marijuana experts, policymakers, medical practitioners, patients, and other amazing individuals with compelling stories to share. It all happens right now. Here's the Cannabis Reporter, Snowden Bishop.
Evergreen is calling.
Hi, and welcome back to the Cannabis Reporter Radio Show. I'm Snowden Bishop. I'm happy you could join us. In our last interview with Jessica Chandler and Denise Mahaffey, we discussed some of the insidious ways in which toxic contaminants turn up in soil substrates commonly used to grow fruits, vegetables, and cannabis. We also talked about the importance of testing at every point in the supply chain from seed to sale. Otherwise, what's to protect patients from toxins, heavy metals, and pathogens that have serious health ramifications? We also touched on ways in which consumers can protect themselves by demanding certificates of analysis from manufacturers of every cannabis product before buying it just to ensure that it's safe. The cannabis industry has, for the most part, been hyper-vigilant about self-testing for obvious reasons. Compliance with state regulations would be one, and earning consumer trust being the other. But on the other hand, the pharmaceutical industry has been shrouded in secrecy. It's rare for a drug company to automatically make a certificate of analysis available for public examination, and even more rare for patients to request one, which seems counterintuitive considering how few of us know where, how, or with what raw materials our prescription drugs are made. And with the exception of regulation by the FDA and DEA, there's really little accountability. It seems strange that we vest so much trust in an industry we know so little about. And more so given that the industry can be blamed for hundreds of thousands of lost lives. Not to mention the presence of toxins and pathogens that really the human body wasn't designed to safely process. The same can be said for vaccines. While inoculations are mandatory in some states, the manufacturers are not required to disclose the binders that carry the pathogens that are injected directly into the bloodstream. Over the last decade, the number of vaccinations required has increased exponentially, as has the number of children who are being diagnosed with pediatric asthma, autoimmune conditions, and autism, which were far less common before the required number of inoculations increased. To be clear, there's no definitive proof that vaccines cause any of these conditions. However, like so many pharmaceutical drugs, they've come under scrutiny due to the incidental correlation between the onset of symptoms and the date of injection. Despite the public consternation, there's little information about the molecular composition and methods used to harvest pathogens, which begs yet another question: why not? If I were a conspiracy theorist, I could hazard a guess that there are dozens of reasons, not the least of which would point to the autonomy vested in the industry by regulatory agencies that kowtow to their powerful lobbies. All things considered, there is a reason why pharmaceutical industry is so shrouded in secrecy. Full disclosure about their methods, sources, and materials could expose them to liability. And what's more, they could be held accountable. That's the topic of today's show, and I'm really excited to introduce our guest, Dr. Judy Mikovits. For nearly 3 decades, she was a researcher at the National Institute of Cancer, and she specialized in retroviruses and developing new drug pathways to deal with the insidious problem. She's also author of the book called Plague, which is an eye-opening expose of what goes on in the pharmaceutical industry and beyond. And she's written her second book now, which is called Plague of Corruption, which goes into some sordid details about how she was targeted and harassed for discovering something that could cost some of the pharmaceutical companies a great deal of money. Dr. Judy, thank you so much for being here. I'm really looking forward to delving into this with you.
Yeah, you're welcome. It's a pleasure to be here, Snowden.
Your book is fascinating, and like I've told you before, I really believe that this should be a New York Times bestseller. The information that you're offering is something that is just not widely known to many people, And I think it's so important that everybody should know about it. But thank you for writing it.
Yeah, most of the thanks goes to Kent Heckenlively, my co-author. He co-wrote the first book, Plague, and basically when you hear me talk, you'll understand that I talk like a scientist. And he said, Judy, if and Kent is currently a sixth grade science teacher, but also a trained attorney, so he knows how to ask questions. So he would literally tape every word I say and turn it into a story, and the story that you see there. So he's just brilliant storyteller, and every word of it is fact, every word of it is on paper, and it's backed up by, as you know, hundreds of references. So that people can actually understand how that we call it. It's called the plague of corruption. And that's because there's so much corruption in medicine and science surrounding not only the topic of the book, which is vaccine injury, but even therapeutics for vaccine injury, which is cannabis. And so we're led to believe by a corrupt media, we're calling it, weed and now the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, is talking at great length about all of this vaping causing all of these horrible things. And it's just to have people not use a plant, which can be used medically to cure a lot of the diseases caused by too much inappropriate activation of the immune system.
So I'm going to ask you to just give the mile high view of both books, both The Plague and Plague of Corruption, for people who haven't read The Plague and who you'd like to read Plague of Corruption once it's published. Just give us the mile high view of it.
Well, it's interesting because it all wraps around to cannabis. So you can find both books and information about them at plaguethebook.com. So the website is plaguethebook.com. And they're both sold on Amazon. You can pre-order the second one as soon as it's out, Plague of Corruption. But the mile high view of Plague is that in 2000, so my entire career is as a cancer scientist studying immune therapies for diseases caused by retroviruses. That's HIV/AIDS. So my thesis actually changed the paradigm for HIV/AIDS, and it was defended on November 14, 1991, and that was a week after Magic Johnson was found to be infected with HIV. And so at that time, everyone infected with HIV was dying, except for a group of people using cannabis. And we can talk about that at great length. And we understand why from a scientific point of view now. At any rate, so my career is developing immune therapy and understanding how viruses dysregulate the immune system to cause disease. And so developing therapies to prevent disease, immune therapies, and that would be the definition of a vaccine. Well, in HIV/AIDS, the big problem was the blood supply was contaminated, and of course, the prevailing dogma that it was only gay men, prostitutes, IV drug users, and the viruses could only be transmitted sexually. Until, of course, we learned of Ryan White, the little boy, and Arthur Ashe, both transfusion transmitted, so the blood supply becoming contaminated. So, the 20,000 foot view of Plague of Disease, the first book called Plague, was that we identified a new family of retroviruses. We isolated them from people with not only autism, but cancer, myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, ME/CFS, any number of cancers. It was first identified as a possibility sequences were found in prostate cancer. So here now is a new family of viruses which caused devastating diseases that didn't kill you right away as HIV/AIDS did, but of course were found, we found the blood supply to be contaminated, as we knew the blood supply was back in the 80s with HIV. And of course, then one of our colleagues suggested that this retrovirus family, because it was related to mouse cancer causing and neurological disease causing viruses, he said one of the most widely used products where we use mouse tissue is biological therapies, including vaccines. So how did a mouse virus get into humans? Well, vaccines. So our paper came out in one of the best journals in the world on October 8th, was published and peer reviewed for more than 6 months, to make sure these data were right. And basically it was just an, oh my God, because it became obvious to us and to all of NIH and the governments worldwide that we had actually caused the zoonosis. That's the jumping from animals into humans of a mouse-related virus, almost certainly by not only a contaminated blood supply, but by vaccines. And this virus was found in even the healthy population, so healthy or apparently healthy carriers, and it's 25 times what HIV was when Magic Johnson was found to have AIDS at the height of the epidemic in the U.S. in 1991.
See, that is the most frightening thing to me, aside from the cover-up that ensued, subsequently. But just to think that a lot of these autoimmune diseases, and let's face it, we have an epidemic of autoimmune conditions in this country.
Correct.
And with the prevalence of all of these autoimmune diseases, the fact that this isn't like the most critical topic when it comes to public health, especially from the government level, it should be. And we should be addressing it right away, just so that the next generation doesn't have to be contaminated the way that we are. And there's this whole movement that has caused a lot of consternation in the medical community, the movement of anti-vax. And I think that what's important for people to understand is that the theory of vaccination is not what's dangerous. Putting these pathogens in the human body to strengthen the immune system and to create antibodies within the human body, that's a very important thing. And we've eradicated a lot of diseases because of it. But the thing that even the anti-vax proponents should understand is it really isn't about that. It's about the zoonosis, as you say, the way that these vaccines are made, these sort of irresponsible way that vaccines are made. We should be demanding as a public, changes to the way that they deliver these vaccines. And by deliver, I mean the formulas that they put into the vaccines, or the way that they're developing the pathogens, number one. But number two, another thing that I've heard is the delivery mechanism of like the corn-based formulas, with some of the toxins that are prevalent in corn products in general, because most of them come from GMO corn. I mean, it's a problem. So what do you tell a discerning public about what they should do to try to protect the vaccine supply, number one, but number two, what can they do to protect their children if they're being forced to subject their children to vaccinations that could potentially be contaminated?
Well, and they, in fact, they are contaminated, and you're exactly right. And it's not corn, in fact, that they're made in. It's there. While there is corn syrup and glyphosate, the Roundup that is associated with cancers now in a big lawsuit. The topic of the second book is the plague of corruption. So we found these zoonoses happening. And as you mentioned, it's not the vaccines of old. It's not the old schedule. It's not the way they were made before. And what most people don't realize is that in 1986, when many of these injuries were becoming apparent with the DTP shot because of the cellular debris from animal tissue. So now they give DTAP, which means acellular pertussis, to mitigate some of these injuries. But when the attorneys were winning all the lawsuits back in the late 70s and early 80s surrounding the DTP shot, basically Ronald Reagan signed into law in 1986. They kind of threatened the government, and the companies said, we won't make your vaccines anymore, and everybody will be at risk of all of these horrible diseases if you don't remove all liability. So in 1986, a law was signed in by then President Reagan to say, that nobody can sue a manufacturer for design defects with vaccines, and they had to go into a special court to all of HHS. And now what we know, because of this movement of, it's called anti-vaxxers, but that's really a bad, because I'm called an anti-vaxxer, and I correct people to say, no, wait a minute, I've spent 40 years making drugs. And those drugs are immune therapies. And those therapies in my career is based on the single notion that we can develop therapies to prevent and treat chronic disease by appropriately modulating the immune system. But it's very difficult to help the parents, because now, of course, the big frenzy by the pharmaceutical companies that really support our press and the New York Times and everything else. This is what the plague of corruption is all about, and the horrible decade that I've gone through, where my career was ruined, my life was ruined. I was almost killed several times, and all of my constitutional rights remain taken away to this day. So, and so many other doctors and scientists have lost their lives as they try to bring inconvenient truths to the government, and this is over the last 40 or 50 years. So what I say to parents, and what we're actually doing, the light at the end of the tunnel. And that's why I mentioned Magic Johnson in my past experience in the book, is that we can stop this, and we can heal the victims of the plague, and we can restore faith in the promise of science. And one of the ways we can do this is by making safe vaccines. And one of the ways we can do that is recognizing that these autoimmune diseases and cancers are actually acquired endocannabinoid immune deficiencies. So it's the dysregulation of our endogenous cannabinoid system. And so these plants, these phytocannabinoids, can be used therapeutically to actually prevent vaccine injuries and cure these, be part of curative therapies, or at least mitigate some of the most horrific parts of these diseases. We can fix it in part with cannabis.
Yeah, and it looks like legal cannabis is on its way. I think that's really going to help. But let me go back to something that you said. One of the things I wanted to just have you explain really briefly is a retrovirus, from what I understand of the text in your book, is basically the virus that has contaminated someone that's laying dormant until it is activated by another pathogen. Am I sort of on the track there?
Yes, you're sort of on the track there. So a retrovirus is a kind of virus that actually can integrate into your DNA. It stays there. Your immune system naturally makes sure, like 8% of our DNA is retroviruses. So these these viruses have enzymes that literally cut open your DNA, reverse transcribe right backwards, which is what retrovirus means, their genome, their RNA genome into DNA, then cut open your DNA and insert themselves. So they can remain with you for generations. And in fact, 8% of our genome is crippled retroviruses. So our immune system is very good at making sure they're not expressed. And HIV is the retrovirus we know the most, and that it came from monkeys, and humans became infected with it, not contaminated, infected with it. And that, of course, was the AIDS epidemic. How the zoonosis, how the transmission from monkeys into humans happened at the level it happened in the early 80s is still a hot debate. And there are a lot of books written on the topic. And of course, the last chapters of our book tell you that we think, in fact, that vaccines and a contaminated blood supply is how HIV spread through the human population, and not the bad behavior of gays or prostitutes or IV drug users or whatever it was that the government told us. So it was really the plague of corruption but surrounding the HIV AIDS epidemic. And then now the retroviruses that are mouse related. Essentially all animals and plants have retroviruses, some of which are very important in the development of a species. So they go back millions of years, and they do lay dormant, and they're not expressed. And it's really important not to activate their expression and to keep a healthy immune system so that they aren't activated. And in part, what the vaccines are doing is, in people with these dormant viruses, the vaccines are waking them up. So it's just in giving vaccines to pregnant women who are already immune suppressed, to cancer patients, to children under 3 years old who haven't developed the mechanisms for silencing retrovirus. So it's not necessarily the vaccines themselves, although these animal tissues, monkey kidney cells, dog cells, mouse cells, bird cells, there's all kinds of retroviruses that we've discovered in the last few years contaminating these vaccines. And this is what the government doesn't want you to know. This is why, this is the really the ferocity behind the vicious nature of this whole anti-vax campaign, because one of the most heavily contaminated vaccines is the MMR. And the MMR, the measles, this is one of the most heavily, it's the live virus vaccines, chickenpox, MMR, some hepatitis A, some of these others that are transmitting these into our children, into our families, into pregnant women. It's just beyond comprehension, and that's why the media and the companies that the media is owned by the pharmaceutical companies. Just watch all the TV. Same thing with New York Times. Same thing with Washington Post. The scientific journals. That was perhaps the thing that I still can't quite get over, is that our scientific journals are little more than propaganda for a pharmaceutical industry that wants to keep you sick.
Well, when we talk about the prohibition of cannabis all these years, and you look at the fact that medical schools still do not focus on the endocannabinoid system as a field of study, or they don't. In fact, I think it's changing now a little bit because there's demand for the study of the endocannabinoid system. The cat's out of the bag. It's hard to put the cat back in.
Right.
But when, as recently as just last year, I think there were still only a handful of medical schools that offered more than just one course, if that, if not just a mention of the endocannabinoid system in the training for becoming a doctor. And one of the reasons behind that is likely the fact that medical school is really training about how to use drugs that are the pharmaceutical industry support. And so, I mean, there's been a lot of consternation about that and a lot of criticism of scientists and journalists who actually bring this up. But I think with the legalization of cannabis, if it happens, I don't know that it'll happen in this particular Congress. It might have to wait until the next one, depending on what happens with the Senate. But it's on the horizon. Cannabis will be legal within the next couple of years, I am pretty certain.
Yeah.
So that might change things, but since it does modulate a lot of the immune function in our body, the endocannabinoid system modulates a lot of the immune function and regulates our metabolism and regulates so many things and protects us from things we didn't even realize. Right. Explain to me how cannabis is going to support or help to eliminate the problem of these retroviruses that are being introduced through the vaccinations. Like, what should a parent know about getting their children on some form of cannabis or CBD at a young age? And how do you reconcile that with all of the rumors about how it's going to affect them developmentally?
Right. Yeah. It's not a fun topic, is it? So
not fun, but it's important.
as far as medical schools go, of course, the endocannabinoid system really wasn't appreciated or discovered until that we had an endogenous cannabinoid system wasn't appreciated until 1994. And of course, we didn't know we had an endogenous opioid system. So the endorphins, and so all of these systems, there are hundreds of molecules, hundreds of receptors. And the way I like to look at the endocannabinoid system is it's actually a dimmer switch on the immune response. So in the context of vaccines, we were talking about, what's wrong with the 21st century vaccines is we give so many so early, and they have these powerful what are called adjuvants. So they're additives like aluminum and mercury and other things that make the immune system think the invader is much more dangerous than it is. And so the presence of endocannabinoid receptors on, let's just say, key immune response cells like the macrophage or the mast cell, these are your frontline defense, your innate immune response, that it tells if you can stimulate the endocannabinoid system at the same time, and just transiently modulate one of those, block one of those receptors during vaccination, it basically sets the dimmer switch so that the flame can't get too high. So you can actually make a safe vaccine, and we're in the process of doing this in several large companies and large efforts here to make a safe vaccine by literally wrapping it in molecules that will transiently block parts of the endocannabinoid system. So the knowledge of cannabis and the endocannabinoid system since it was discovered in 1994 is literally tens and thousands of peer-reviewed published studies, and the opportunity to use those therapeutically, this in a preventative strategy for all of these diseases we've been talking about, not just retroviral associated diseases, but autoimmune diseases associated with aluminum and other environmental toxins and cancer causing agents. This is the opportunity. In fact, the United States government has held the patent since 2003 using cannabis for many of these anxiety and pain disorders, among other things. So that research has been shipped overseas to primarily Israel and other places have been the pioneers in that research, and U.S. money's going there, all the while Americans and researchers are still being arrested, or manufacturers for using, even the acidic versions in a medical form, because it's considered a Schedule One drug. So the problem becomes, it becomes legal, and the pharmaceutical companies take over and develop blocking agents, which of course would, we know, can kill people. We need to use the plant, as a whole plant, and use it in the appropriate population, because during development, in puberty, you really need to balance the endocannabinoid system in order to develop all the higher learning functions. So there is a danger to it. We don't we in the medical industry don't prefer recreational use, because using cannabis, like any plant, or any drug, even vaccines used at the wrong time, can be extremely dangerous if you don't understand what you're doing with it. So it's really a double-edged sword that you appreciate. Because it's not. I don't recommend that parents use various CBD or THC CBD oils or products really without consulting a knowledgeable medical professional. And you mentioned that that's not usually available. The good news is that breastfeeding is often the last time most infants and babies and people receive their endogenous cannabinoids, because we make anandamide is the endogenous THC. It means joy in Sanskrit, so as you probably know. So the endogenous, we can stimulate the production of your own cannabinoids and avoid using phytocannabinoids, plant-based cannabinoids, and drugs during critical times where you don't want necessarily to have immunosuppression. So, if we can, the reason why I'm delighted to talk to you about this today is because if we can recognize that and take the stigma away from the use of plants, stop of this plant family, stop calling it weed, and really start studying and using it there are universities, as you mentioned. We've long worked with Johns Hopkins University and Vincent DiMarzo, who has done an awful lot of work with cannabinoids in not only autoimmune disease, but cancers associated with retroviruses, like prostate cancer. And I mentioned at the beginning of the show, the AIDS patients, what we found in the 80s, and it's the movie The Dallas Buyers Club kind of highlights this a little bit, but stays away from it a little bit. But when you use existing chemotherapies, and use at the same time cannabis in the form of food, edibles, oils, things like that, you can actually stop some of the side effects, like the vomiting or the lack of sleep, and the cachexia, the extreme weight loss, which is often what kills the patient. So rational combination of cannabis, edibles, oils, and even pills has been used very successfully, at least the last decade or so, worldwide, with both synthetics and plant-based. But the synthetics are very, very dangerous, because you're talking about critical pathways, and you can actually, we know of deaths with some of the synthetics, because if you block, for instance, there was a drug made by, it doesn't matter, a drug made for the the pain receptor known as TRPV1, trans receptor potential vanilloid number 1, and that's your hot and cold pain sensor. But the drug never made it to market because you could literally put your hand in a fire and watch it burn, and you would die before you felt pain. Their channels, their ion channels, their G coupled proteins. That's the science behind it that Kent tries to take out of my book. But that they're very important signaling molecules on every cell in the body, and it's in the crosstalk between the neurons, the nerve cells, and the immune cells is just critical. Not every cell in the body, every immune and pain receptor neuron and nerve cell. So it's really important to know what you're doing. But in fact, we've done this successfully for at least 30 years, and in the recognition. So, our book, Plague of Corruption, is really about the corruption of all of medicine, not only enforcing therapeutics on people without without any informed consent in dangerous drugs like the vaccines, but also in preventing Americans from using and knowing and doing research and developing cannabis as therapies for any number of things, any number of conditions. We could change everything with cannabis, and we could do it tomorrow because the drugs exist.
It's fascinating. I want to go back to something that you said about using the plant substance in its whole and the dangers of manipulating the plant substances into synthetic drugs, basically.
Right.
I just wonder, this is something I've been very concerned about with the advent of legalization of cannabis, in that now it will open up doorways for pharmaceuticals to come in and sort of play with the plant and create something that's going to be a lot more profitable for them, but will take the rather miraculous nature of the plant itself out of the medicine. And
correct.
I'm almost wondering if eventually, we're at this period in history where we need to start getting back to basics. And one of the things, obviously, that most people are concerned about, if they trust science as opposed to trust, political agendas, is climate change. And, I'm a big believer that hemp is something that could really help us get back to nature in terms of creating things without altering our lifestyle, making plastics, for instance, out of, hemp biomass, as opposed to using, the highly carbon consumptive and toxic fossil fuels, just as an example, or, quit deforestation to make paper or building materials and use hemp instead. So when it comes to, transitioning into plant-based medicine, which really sustained human life for thousands and thousands of years, and get away from the toxicity of these chemicals that are being manufactured, en masse by pharmaceutical companies that are basically, killing people left and right. It's almost genocide level killing that's going on with these chemicals that just aren't meant to be ingested by humans.
Right.
So
yeah.
So we almost need to, I think, there are a lot of people who might disagree with the level of regulation from the government, but the absence of certain regulations is causing human death. And if people can just start to understand that and start putting pressure on their congressional representatives to go back and revisit some of the deregulation that's happened in certain industries, and particularly in the pharmaceutical industry, and start demanding that the FDA, rather than approving a drug if it has a 30% success rate, maybe they start approving drugs that only pass certain criteria, like they don't cause human harm. And the destigmatization of the cannabis plant is a good place to start. But I'm wondering, in your experience, is there a way that a pharmaceutical company can adhere to nature and be as profitable rather than make these drugs that, just don't consider all of these things that you've brought up in your books.
Mhm.
What can we
Yeah.
do to try to fix this problem?
Absolutely, and in fact, my my training and my first job was making cancer therapies out of plants in 1980. And so those therapies I talked about, and there are companies that exist right now that make drugs out of plants that have gone away from synthetics, but those companies can't get their drugs to market because of the corruption and the control of the pharmaceutical industries who want these synthetics. And so it's interesting because the timing is similar. Let's just say since the mid 60s, the timing is similar where we've moved away from plants in the 80s with all of this recombinant technology, and now the big oh my god is the trillions of dollars spent on these drugs. They are doing more harm than good, and in fact a very simple change can be made, because you mentioned the Food and Drug Administration, and if you think about it, the Food and Drug Administration is only there for safety. They only tell you when your food is dangerous. They don't tell you, for instance, they identify that there's a batch of spinach that has salmonella or whatever in it. They don't tell you what food to eat or what food you can't eat. Yet they gave themselves the authority to tell you not only what drug is safe to be used in whatever condition or way, and I mean the you is the medical professionals, but they tell you it's not, you can't use certain drugs in certain things. They tell you not only safety but efficacy. So we can simply change everything, saying it's back to the medical professional, and the FDA has no right to determine, as long as a company proves their therapy is safe. They don't have to prove it efficacious in this cancer, that cancer, or anything else. As long as you do no harm, a doctor can use whatever they want. That would change everything, and it is a simple fix that I guess Congress, senators, I don't know who has to overturn this, but that authority was given to, the FDA gave themselves that authority, probably bolstered by pharmaceutical companies who wanted to capture the market. I've worked for a company, and in 1994, I think it could be 2004. 2004, the government issued the Botanical Drug Guidance Act. And what that says is, as long you can make a drug not as a single agent synthetic compound, as long as you can identify all the components of the plant and show the bioactivity, and again show the safety in long-term safety studies. So I've worked for a company since 2005 that has a fabulous natural product drug made of some mushrooms and some other plants that we know were. I'm a plant. I make drugs out of plants. That was my original training. And so, and you can easily add cannabis extracts to that and understand how they act biologically. So yes, all of medicine is broken, but there are some simple fixes, because right now, medicine is being legislated by laws, by you can't use this. So I've fought for the last 5 years in various courts across in states, including Arizona and others, saying, legalize medical cannabis for autism, for children, for this cancer, for that cancer. And we usually lose for the stigma of, oh, you're going to hurt them, you're going to turn them into Cheech and Chong and dopers and lose, they'll go psychotic and things like that. And really the opposite is true. if you know, and we change medicine to letting the doctors be appropriately educated and use the compounds. And there are many companies that can make these and are making these for these indications. So the FDA really needs to go away or be revamped, to stop this, because that's where the holdup is. This company's drug that I've been working with since 2005 still hasn't gotten FDA approval because they simply don't want to change the paradigm. And you literally have to pay millions of dollars to get your drug in line so that they look at it and approve it. So we've gone through several safety clinical trials and other things. It's disgusting, really, but the big pharma has corrupted all of the drug industry. And it's not that we don't know how to make drugs from plants. It's that we have to allow manufacturers to make drugs from plants and stop the capture of an entire industry to make synthetics. And that's what's happening. So when those laws change so that the pharmaceutical industry doesn't own our legislators, doesn't own our newspapers, our journals, and everything else, and we in fact are free to make those drugs the way we know we can, and we have been for my entire 40-year career, that's when we'll win.
Yeah, it's astounding that the regulation of drugs and the manufacturing of drugs is conducted by people who are not healers. They are bureaucrats, and
they have a vested interest. They're making a lot of money to not make these healing products. So my experience in the cannabis industry is something that, I'm in California right now, that I now can, I can't even tell you the benefit I can get from a whole plant extract, CO2 extracted, $20. So after all the regulations and the licensing that the manufacturers have to get, and somebody's got somebody's hands in the pockets, it probably costs the patient hundreds, if not thousands. And this is where medicine is broken. It needs to end. And so we still give it at $20.
Well, it seems completely unethical, and it's just wrong, if I want to put a word to it, that millions of dollars go into subsidizing the research that's being conducted by the pharmaceutical industry in the United States, and then having received all of that money to conduct the research and develop the drugs that they are developing, then they're basically gouging the patients and justifying it because they've had to do all of this research to get their drugs approved, but without telling you that, they received subsidies to do the research to get these drugs approved. So it just seems criminal almost.
It's criminal, and it's at every level of our government. I was exactly that. I was a National Cancer Institute, and that's the Bayh-Dole Act of, I think, 1983. So Bayh Dole Act. We could repeal that act right away, because what it said was that government workers and government employees could patent. Just like I told you that government holds the patent on cannabis therapies, could patent their research. No. I say taxpayers paid for my entire education. They turned the lights on in the building for the 22 years I worked at the National Cancer Institute. They own, the taxpayer owns everything. There is no intellectual property in my world. It's all God's and the taxpayers. They paid for it all.
Yeah. Well, and the scientists are just getting the bum rap all around if they contradict the corporate interests.
Absolutely. The scientists are, unless they're the ones who are bought and paid for, like you said, so many of the scientists are, we're not committing the crimes. We didn't cover up the data. We didn't cut, and my friends, but my many of my friends, when faced with the kinds of decisions that we had to make, for which, Dr. Rossetti and myself, there is no choice. We show all the data. We don't use statistics. We don't cover it up. And I'm certainly sorry that I lost my entire life's earnings, many of my friends, much of my family, my reputation. I'm certainly sorry about that. But there's nothing. Many of my friends lost their lives. We escaped. That's why we tell the stories in Plague of Corruption, because some of them are quite entertaining. God has a sense of humor, we like to say, but there is no choice. But many of my colleagues in science and medicine simply don't know. And that's why we wrote the books, and that's why Dr. Rossetti and I educate on cannabis and on many other topics, and try to educate those doctors, because doctors would never, ever, ever want to hurt a patient, and they're being lied to, just like they've had no education on cannabis, they've had no education on nutrition, they've had no education on vaccines. So we can restore faith in the promise of science. It's not science that's the problem. It's the corruption in science, and unfortunately, it's the highest levels of our government. The very people that are supposed to be protecting you are profiting and taking money, while our economy and the health of our families is failing.
Well, we're at war with facts right now, and this is a problem that it's permeating every aspect of our society right now. And you've got people in bubbles listening to one side of a story, not getting all of the facts, and facts are irrelevant really when it comes to the politics of this, and especially when it comes to the special interests. So, it's a godsend actually that you were able to use your intellect to bring these stories to the public. And like I said early on in this interview, I really believe that the information you set forth in your books is really, really valuable and could save lives. So, and I hope that ultimately we get beyond this period in our history when facts are the enemy, and really start paying attention to science again. I mean, I look with astonishment every single day when I see things happening, like, in 2017, when the facts about climate change were removed from the EPA website. It's like, why? What planet are these people going to live on when they destroy this one? And aren't these people also affected by the vaccines that we're giving children and pregnant women?
Right.
It just makes me wonder, what kind of vacuum they must be living in, and is money that important that you have to sacrifice human life for it? It just makes no sense to me. So,
there's a great, I think the fact of the matter is, these people are public health officials, and it is worldwide. It's the WHO, the World Health Organization. It's Bill Gates. It's Rockefellers. It's the people who own, that it is a genocide, and I'd like to say it is a Holocaust. And it's just, we've decided who's going to be the fittest, and who can live, and who dies. I mean, and it's the same. There's a fabulous book by David Lewis called Science for Sale. And he's the Judy Mikovits within the Environmental Protection Agency. And, the Environmental Protection Agency, the only thing they're protecting are the agency heads and the people who know what's happening to our earth, who know the contamination of our soil, who know that, they're blaming the wrong people. And there's, it is bad, but I think the day is now. I think we've won. I think because of things like your show, that the internet. I mean, intelligent people can read books and find out, and we believe our lying eyes. All we have to do is look at the movie Vaxxed, and now Vax 2, which is the people's truth. And Andy Wakefield, Bobby Kennedy Jr., Dr. Suzanne Humphreys, Del Bigtree, Polly Tommey, in this movement, they simply filmed the vaccine injured, showed you how many they were, and then showed you the vaccine free. So when people start realizing, how can a perfectly healthy child put somebody at risk? How can somebody who's never been injected with a pathogen be infectious? And if your vaccine works to develop immunity, which they don't, none on the market does, and none has ever been safety tested. So now people can realize this because, of course, if we had if the vaccine works, why do you worry if my child is not vaccinated or if I'm not? Because, vaccinated does not equal immune. And that's what we have learned the hard way over the last 40 years. And so to simply restore liability to companies, and take away the power of these agencies that are corrupting. They have anything but our public health in mind. And we could balance the budget immediately. Just close the Centers for Disease Control. All they're doing is controlling the development of disease, which is, I guess, their goal, because they're not preventing anything, and all they're preventing is us from healing using therapies like cannabis therapies, which they well know will heal and will prevent the kind of injuries we're seeing. We can develop a safe vaccine, and we can develop safe therapeutics from plants the way we used to. It doesn't have to cost the kind of money it costs. And as you said, this is just ridiculous. I developed some of those drugs back in the 80s, and they don't cost 10 cents. Why are they charging $10,000?
Such a good point. Well, it's such important information, and I think that the work that you do is incredibly important. And I'm so sorry that you've had to endure the ridicule and the smear campaigns and the life threats and all of those things. And it pains me that any scientist doing their job for greater good has had to endure anything like this. And, we see a lot of holistic medical professionals, taking their own lives, and we see people ostracized, even USDA scientists basically exiled to Kansas, away from their laboratories because, somehow they're getting in the way of corporate interests. And I mean, there's no other way to say that. And that's not a conspiracy theory. It's just simply a fact.
Yeah.
And it's inexcusable that we are tolerating this as people, and to call it a Holocaust in a way, not to take away from the gravity of what happened in Germany in the 40s. But really, when you consider that 40,000 people a year are dying because of a handful of drugs that doctors were told by the manufacturers were safe, and they didn't have any disclosures to work with that would say that these drugs will either kill you or create addiction that'll lead to heroin addiction, it's criminal. And quite frankly, I keep thinking that they should be charged with crimes against humanity. Forget these $40 million lawsuits. It's a drop in the bucket for them.
Right. It's the cost of doing business. No, they should be charged with crimes against humanity. I gave a talk at The Truth About Cancer a few weeks ago here in Anaheim, and I was asked to give the title of the talk I was asked to give was Persecution and Cover-Up. And I showed pictures of these criminals, these heads of departments, these heads of NIH, of NIAID, of the pharmaceutical companies, and the list of names, and the call to action was to charge them with crimes against humanity, because it's so much more than. And I think the only good news behind the opioid crisis is that people are waking up up and they can see it, and people are waking up and realizing, the FDA approved the most powerful opioid ever a few weeks ago. And it's like, you're kidding me, right? And that these criminals are not prosecuted in a $40 billion lawsuit. And it goes with glyphosate as well, with Roundup, with Monsanto, with GMO. It's so big, but it could be stopped. The cost of doing business is $100 million. You've been causing cancer, that our constitutional rights, the data have been censored, our very freedom for the Nuremberg Code not to be used as human test subjects when none of these vaccines have been tested. They do post-licensure marketing, as you'll see when you get to the end of the book. It's criminal, and it needs to all stop today. And when our freedoms are restored, we'll use cannabis and every other natural product and natural way of healing. And it's pretty easy. That's why I always use the Magic Johnson example, because when he got infected, everybody was dying. And I never thought we could fix it. And we did. So the science is there, the compassion, the humanity, the brilliance is there, and all we have to do. And that's why your show and shows like your show are so important, because it wakes everybody up to realize that we can have a better world. We can restore faith in the promise of science and medicine, and everybody wins. Everybody wins. Our economy, there's nothing about our country that people can go back to work. People in so much pain who can't sleep, who can't eat, who can't metabolize food. There just isn't any area that I can think of in health where cannabis couldn't be of value.
It is incredibly valuable, and you are so right. Well, Dr. Judy, I am so grateful that you were able to share all of this with us today, and I am getting a signal that it's time to start wrapping it up, but any last thoughts before we go?
Well, I just, love what you do, and encourage everybody to, to look into things and not necessarily believe what you've been told. Dig a little deeper and see where the real truth is, and it might not be on your TV set.
Great advice, and I thank you for that. And I thank you so much for being with me today.
It was a pleasure. It's a delight to meet you.
Thank you. Oh, well, it is time to bring yet another show to a close. I'd like to personally thank my guest, Dr. Judy Mikovits, for sharing her insights and knowledge with us today. If you'd like to learn more about her books or the work that she's doing, please visit us online at CannabisRadio.com. Click podcast to find today's episode, and that's where you'll find her bio along with information about how to connect with her. We have so many people to thank. First, I'd like to express our gratitude for our partners and radio sponsors, Canisphere Biotech, the Growers Network, and Blue Mountain Energy. We certainly couldn't be doing this without you. I'd also like to thank the team here at the Cannabis Reporter Radio Show for always making us shine. And of course, it goes without saying how much we appreciate our programming directors at XRQK Radio Network and Society Bites Radio for distributing our show. And last but not least, thanks to all of you for listening. I'm Snowden Bishop, inviting you to join me again next week, same time, same place, for another episode of the Cannabis Reporter Radio Show. Until we meet again, be safe, stay informed, share what you've learned, and make it a great day.
Evergreen's calling.